Welcome to Dental Business RX. Practice success in 30 minutes or less.
Thank you for calling ABC Dental.
Are you having trouble finding a hygienist? If you are, you're not alone. For that matter, since reopening in 2020, after the pandemic shutdowns, this has been a problem industry-wide, even for MGE clients. And to that end, we here at MGE had to dig into the issue and figure out a way around it because we couldn't have our clients hygienist-less, if that's a word. And that's what I want to talk about in this episode of Dental Business RX, specifically what's happening in the hygiene and labor market, along with how to find and hire a hygienist in today's business environment. My name is Jeff Bloomberg, and I'm your host. And before I get into the actions to take to find a hygienist, I just want to cover a couple points on the subject of your hygiene department in general, because inevitably, and I saw this happen not to clients, but to other dentists that I spoke with, where, they lost their hygienist because their hygienist decided to not come back to work, or they moved out of state after all the shutdowns and whatnot. And they made the decision to just keep going, do their hygiene on their own or reduce their number of days of hygiene. And that was not a good idea. Hygiene or your hygiene department is extremely important for your practice. If you're a general dentist, it's actually critical. Number one, it's how your office actually achieves its purpose. If you take a look at if the purpose of your office is to improve patients' health, function, and aesthetic long term, help them keep their teeth for the rest of their life, well, your hygiene department, number one, gives you a mechanism to see these patients regularly, as well as keeping their gums healthy and their teeth clean and whatnot. But it gives you a mechanism to have them keep coming back into the practice so that you can maintain their oral health. Number two, it's what builds your practice. If I've used this example before, if you had two practices you were going to purchase and they each were doing $1 million a year, and one was doing $500,000 in hygiene production and the other was doing $100,000 with a part-time hygienist, which one do you buy? You're buying, I would hope, the one doing a lot of hygiene production, because you're not going to have to go in there and do all types of crazy procedures to pull off your production target. So it builds your practice. It makes your practice more viable. And if the owner doc is doing hygiene as a routine thing with no end in sight, it is a no-go. There's going to be no expansion long-term. It's a bad business idea. And if you take a look at how much a dentist is worth chairside per hour, there's no way doing hygiene is ever going to even come close to what you potentially could be doing. So let's start off with looking at the overall market conditions for finding and hiring a hygienist right now. In 2020, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, BLS.gov, and I'll have this link on the podcast page, noted that there were 194,830 hygienists in the United States. Now, as a point of comparison, that same survey from the BLS showed that there were 201,117 dentists. That includes specialists, though, and it wasn't separated in this report. In 2019, there was a separated report, and it was about 160,000 dentists. So you figure out of those 200,000 dentists in the U.S., about 40-plus thousand are specialists. So we're talking about 160,000 dentists in the U.S., general dentists, and 194,830 hygienists. So there are more hygienists than general dentists. Now, truthfully, that's probably not enough. And it's very locality based. You'll have areas where there's a lot of hygienists available, and you'll have other areas where there's very few. For that matter, back in the 1990s, when I was in Chicago, the ratio of doctors to hygienists was 5-1. There was 5 doctors, dentists, for every 1 hygienist in the Chicagoland area. So if you were calling a temp hygienist, 9 times out of 10, you were getting a dentist who was filling in that day. So sure, there could definitely be more. There could absolutely be more. But this has only been exacerbated post-pandemic. It seems like, and this is more anecdotal, it does seem like there are more hygienists either not coming back to work full-time. This is at least the anecdotal reports I'm getting from clients, or have decided to move or change careers, etc. Then that's occurred with dentists. So it seems like the hygiene supply has definitely dropped. And then on top of that, making this worse is you have less availability and wages have gone up drastically. And to give you an idea, and you've probably seen this, I'm not talking to something that you don't see, but to give you an idea, in 2020, that same BLS report listed the average median wage, middle wage for a hygienist in the United States at $37 an hour. And at the high end, it was $50 an hour. So average was 37, high end was $50. Compare that to what you're seeing now just a year later. And this becomes a real problem, especially, and I talked about this back in episode 7 with insurance plans. This becomes a real problem when you are accepting a lot of reduced fee plans. If you're in network, if you have a bunch of PPOs, where what you're getting is next to nothing compared to what you'd be getting full fee. Especially, in other words, the hygiene wages go way up, and all of a sudden your compensation as a percentage with what you're paying the hygienist goes up at the same time. To give you a point, let me give you some basic math here. I had a client at a seminar a couple weeks ago who's in the hiring process with a hygienist. He told me he had 2 applicants. He's in Southern California. He had 2 applicants. One wanted $68 an hour and one wanted $70. 68 and 70. So just for fun, I decided, let's take a look at how this would impact a dental practice in his area. So I took his zip code, and there's a website called feelookup.com, feelookup.com. And it looks like it's made by MetLife. MetLife's logo is all over it. So if it's not made by MetLife, I'm sure they're going to be sued shortly. But I believe this is a MetLife site, but it's called feelookup.com. I entered this doctor's zip code, and this doctor does not participate in MetLife. I just wanted to see if I was a dentist in that area, and I did, how would this impact me? Well, I took a basic prophy visit, a periodic oral exam, 4 bite wings, and an adult prophy, right? 0120, 1110, and a cleaning, all right? The MetLife in-network fee for this zip code was $31 for the exam, $36 for the bite wings, and $64 for a cleaning, for a total of $131, all right? Now, on that same site, on FeeLookup, they show what the full fee, the average full fee in the area is, and they give you a range. So I took the average. The average full fee for those 3 procedures that I just described is $308. So $131 in network, $308 out of network. So now I want you to get this in your mind for a second. So let's say you practice in this area in Southern California. You're in MetLife. You're charging $131 for an adult prophy or an adult 6-month recall with including bite wings and an exam. And that hygienist wants $68 an hour. That's almost 52% of the revenue you're making from that procedure. And remind you, things have slowed down post-COVID a little bit as far as how long it takes to turn a room over and whatnot. That's 51.9%. It would be the hygienist pay for that procedure if you were in network. It becomes almost unaffordable. Now, compare that to the $308 and you're at 22%, that starts to work. So you need to get out of plans. That's a whole thing. I talk about it in episode 7 as far as what to do. I'm not going to get into that here, but I just wanted to throw that out there because I know this has been a consideration when you're looking to find a hygienist because the wages have started to go up exponentially in the last, probably I would say post-pandemic, especially in 2021, it's become a real problem. So let's talk about, let's say you don't have a hygienist or you need one or you're going to be looking for one. How would you go about finding one in this environment? What are we telling MGE clients? So I'm going to give you a sequence of actions. And obviously, it's up to you whether you want to do these or not. Everybody's responsible for their own condition. That's my drug company disclaimer there. You got to decide what you're going to do and what you're not. But I'm going to describe these in sort of an escalating sequence. In other words, start here. If that doesn't work, then do this. If that doesn't work, then do this. I mean, you could do all at the same time if you wanted to, but I'm going to kind of escalate as we go if we're not seeing any benefit from the initial steps. So let's take a look at the first step, obviously, and this is probably what you've already done, which is place ads, on Indeed or Dental Post or something of this nature. You place an ad. Now, a couple of things I'd mention about your ad. First thing is, make sure the ad isn't all about you. And this is important to know when you're placing an ad to hire somebody. Very often, and I've seen this with doctors, I've seen it with managers too. This even applies to new patient advertising. When you're formulating your advertising, you're doing it from the viewpoint that you're advertising to yourself. In other words, what would you like? The problem is you are not your potential public. If you're advertising for a hygienist, you're not the hygienist you're trying to hire. So you sort of have to step into that mindset. What would they be looking for to come to work in your office? So make sure your ad communicates to them in a way that it shows them the benefits of working in your office. That's point number one. Point number two is when you get responses to these ads, you need to respond quickly. You need to call them back, email them, contact them, set up that interview quickly. This, if I had to pick in the hiring process where I see one of the biggest mistakes that are made by small business owners and dentists especially, is you'll get a response. And this goes for any position for that matter. This isn't just hygienist you would call back quickly. It's everybody. So someone, especially in a job market like this, someone responds to your ad, then you're real busy, so you don't have time to call them today, so you don't get around to it for 3-4 days. What do you think they're doing in that 3 to 4 day period? They're still looking for work. How often have you waited too long and then you found out they took another position? Well, generally, if somebody is moving and they're hustling, they're trying to get working, that's what they're going to do. Especially the really productive employees, they're going to want to find a job quick. So you want to call them back as quickly, as close to instant as possible. That's the point. Call them back quickly. That you want to get them in. You want to get them in for an interview. And I would, unless there's something that where it just looks like it's absolutely not a match. They want 1 day a week and you're looking for full time and you could not reconcile yourself to having somebody there 1 day a week. You want to contact them quickly. Last point with regards to your ads is you may want to remove some of the filters that you're putting in that aren't necessarily critical to, 5 years experience, a filter that isn't critical to whether or not they're going to make it in your practice. We have a tendency to want to filter things down a little bit, so that we can kind of get the best product out at the end. Like, for example, this happens with new patients. You'll have somebody who gives a new patient calling in the third degree just to make sure that the patients we bring into the practice are the ideal patients. That's sort of the wrong viewpoint. I mean, sure, if a patient asks, do you take my HMO? I would tell them that I wouldn't or that I don't. But especially if you don't, but I would want to do as much as I could to get the person in. You don't want to add too many blocks or barriers to getting leads when you have potential inquiries. So that's the subject of ads. Next thing I would do is at the same time I'm placing ads, I would ask my team. Chances are some of the team in your practice, if not maybe at least one or two of them, maybe more, have had experience in the dental industry for quite some time, so they have contacts. So you would want them to sort of put the word out to people they know, or maybe they know somebody and can, round somebody up that could be potentially a decent applicant for your practice. So let's say that's not going anywhere. You've placed ads, you've asked your team, nothing's happening. You're not finding that hygienist that you need. From there, you could reach out to the local hygiene school or hygiene program if there's one in your area, including the teachers or instructors rather, because they'll know hygienists. They trained a lot of the ones in your area. You might have hygiene Facebook groups in your area or social media groups where people would allow you to make a post of some kind. You could also reach out to your state. You have the American Dental Hygienists Association, the ADHA. They have a website you could advertise on possibly. They have a newsletter. There's also emails, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the point being is you could reach out to local organizations in your area, possibly place ads as a way to reach potential applicants. One other thing you could do, and this is something that I've told people to do, and some people take me up on it and some people don't. Years back, I remember the first time we ever experienced this was 2003. We had a client who could just not find an associate. This wasn't a hygienist, this was an associate, but could not find an associate for the life of him. And her husband was the office manager, and they were talking to Sabri. Many of you have heard Sabri on earlier podcasts, or Deputy Chief Operating Officer. And Sabri told him, look, you need to contact every dentist in your town and see if they know somebody. He said, really? He said, yeah, really. So this fellow got home. He was great. And he took out the yellow pages, which for you young people, the yellow pages were that thick book that when you were younger, you used to ask your parents, what's this stupid book that somebody dropped at your door? For your younger people, that's what my kids did. And the yellow pages had business listings in it. Obviously, most of us know that. And so he pulled out the yellow pages. He went under dentist, and he started with A, and he started calling people. He got down about, I think it was like 12 or 15 names, and he found an associate. The doctor he called knew an associate or knew a friend of his or a colleague of his who was moving into town. Boom, there was his associate. You could do the same thing for hygienists. You call, hey, we're looking for a hygienist. Do you know of anybody? It's also not a bad idea to get to know the people in your town, and those folks are going to know hygienists. So that's the next thing you can do. So, we're escalating here. Now, the next point I would go to, so let's say I've done all that. I've put out all this communication. I've called all the dentists in my town, which that could take quite a while depending on where you practice. I have contacted the local associations. I've made social media posts. I've placed ads. Still nothing. Assuming that I'm calling people back when they apply and I'm not making it impossible to apply, I now need to crank it up a notch. If you practice in the U.S., and let's say you're practicing in, I don't know, well, let's just take our area, Tampa Bay area. If you're practicing in the Tampa area, the hygienists you're looking for have to be licensed in the state of Florida. So a hygienist practicing in Miami could also practice in Tampa Bay. So the next point you could kind of notch up, if you wanted to step this up a little bit, is reach out to the hygienists in your state. Now, how would you reach out to them? There are a number of different ways. You could start with email. The ADHA does an email list rental where they'll broadcast an email out for you. That might cost you a couple bucks, but it would be worthwhile. Dental Town could probably filter out the hygienists on their list as an example. I'm not saying they do, but I'm just throwing some ideas out here. There are different organizations that are going to have hygienists on their email lists. If you wanted to start with email, you could also buy advertising in some of these magazines, although I really don't know what the readership for these things are like anymore. I would prefer a more direct individual communication because now I'm spending a couple dollars. But if I'm calling an employment agency or a headhunter, I'm paying a lot more than that. If I broadcast email, let's say it costs me, and again, I don't know the fees for these things. I know what broadcast emails cost, but I don't know for these specific issues or organizations. But, let's say you spent $3,000 or $4,000 for a broadcast email, which I know sounds like a lot. We've spent more on broadcast emails to the whole industry, and not that much more, though, funnily enough. And we hit every dentist they have on file. So you do a broadcast email, say it costs you $3,000, $4,000, and if you hire a hygienist on that, that's probably going to cost you probably get a bunch of applicants. That will cost you a lot less than if you were to pay a headhunter. It just would. So you hire somebody from within the state, you can pay some nominal relocation costs, boom, you have a hygienist. And most likely you'll have more than just one or two applicants at that point. And again, depending on where you're at might be desirable for someone to move to your area. Like for instance, here in Tampa Bay, someone might be living in Miami and they want to move up to Tampa Bay. It could happen. Or move to Tampa from Jacksonville. You'll have the same thing going on in your state. So that would be the sort of the series of actions we've advised clients to do, where you would escalate it until you finally found somebody who worked out in your practice. Let's say you've done all of that, and I've yet to see somebody that this has happened to, okay? Yet to see someone this has happened to. But let's say you've gone through all of that. You've gone down this whole line. Still no hygienist. Okay, so do you start doing your own hygiene at that point or cut hygiene days? No. Here's what you do. You go and hire an associate who can fill in as a hygienist temporarily until you can find one. I know that sounds a bit weird to some people, like why would a doctor want to do hygiene? Some doctors are just looking for work. In many areas, there's more availability for dentists than there are hygienists, as I was mentioning to you earlier, like when I was up in Chicago. And with where hygiene pay is going at this point, like I gave you that example earlier of $68 to $70 an hour, in that case, I was speaking to this client, if you're paying $68 or $70 an hour for a hygienist, for an extra $60 a day, you can get a doctor. Something to think about. And then that might actually offer you some growth opportunity. Let's say you had 4 days of hygiene that you needed to replace, you needed a provider for. You hire an associate, and you have them take over that hygiene. You tell them, look, I know it's not your ideal situation, but the idea is that eventually you're going to replace them as a hygienist and then move them over to becoming, your associate and doing dental work. That could work. I've seen lots of people do that, and it's worked out really well. And especially with where wages are going, it's becoming more and more realistic. The only warning I would give you there is this. If you're building a practice, just a standard, run-of-the-mill general dental practice, you don't want to ever exceed a 1 to 1.5 ratio for doctor to hygiene. And let me explain. So if you have one doctor, you don't want them to have, let's say it's a 4-day-a-week practice, one general dentist, you don't want them to have more than 6 days of hygiene. Because what's going to happen is you have those double days where it actually becomes counterproductive. If you're having to bop out of your chair twice an hour to do an exam, it becomes counterproductive to your ability to sell dentistry and deliver it. It can actually lower your production if you do that. So 1 to 1.5 is the ideal position to be in. So once you start exceeding that, then it's time to bring in an associate doctor. So let's talk about this as far as with relation to bringing in an associate as a hygienist. So let's say you just lost your hygienist, you had 4 days of hygiene, and here you are, it's a 4-day-a-week practice, right? You're practicing chairside 4 days a week, and you have a hygienist 4 days a week. So what do? You just lost your hygienist, you bring in an associate, they start covering the hygiene. Again, the kind of associate we're looking for, we're not looking for somebody who's been out of school for 9 years and is placing implants regularly. This is probably not your guy or girl. You're probably looking for a newer graduate who's maybe looking for a mentorship type situation where they can learn, or maybe somebody who's slowed down a bit and they just want to, keep their hand in the industry. This offers a couple advantages. Number one, in some states, you can't have hygiene done if there's not a doctor on site. Well, if you have a doctor doing hygiene, you can walk out if you have to. They may be even willing to cover on call or be on call for you, cover emergencies and things like this. But then let's take this scenario. You've brought this associate in and they are covering your 4 days of hygiene and you're doing 4 days of dentistry. So what do we want to do? What we most likely want to do is we want to work towards adding 2 days of hygiene somehow. And we might bring in 2 part-time hygienists to cover those 2 days. Now, why are we doing this? We're trying to create more volume because then there's going to be enough volume to justify expanding that associate who's now doing hygiene only into doing some dentistry. All right. So what that might look like long term is you added 2 days of hygiene and so if you look at this original configuration is doctor and associate being a hygienist. So it's 1-to-1. Now you add 2 days of hygiene. Now it's 1-to-1.5. 1-to-1.5. So then what we could do is we could balance this out. If that associate were to pick up 2 doctor days and you replace the 2 hygiene days they're doing, then they are doing 2 days of dentistry and 2 days of hygiene. And then you have hygienists doing the other 4 days of hygiene. All right. And this also buys you time to find a hygienist. I know I was kind of getting a little bit into this a little bit with the math and whatnot, but I wanted you to think with this as a potential expansion issue. You could use this for expansion potential going forward. So those are the points I would go through. That's how I would escalate if I needed to in order to find a hygienist. Not having a hygienist at all, canceling or reducing your hygiene schedule if the patients are there to fill it, or doing it yourself long term are not good business answers. It's something you absolutely don't want to do. And if you're having trouble with this or any other area of your office and you want help, feel free to give us a call here at MGE at 800-640-1140. You can find us online at mgeonline.com. And also, we do these podcasts. The whole intention of this podcast originally was just to help, provide information that you could start using in your practice right away. We don't ask for anything for it, and that's the way it's structured. We just want to help. But if you wouldn't mind, if you have a second, if you enjoy it, you want to hear more stuff like this, and you enjoy the podcast, take a minute to follow us. Definitely helps in the long term, and we'd appreciate it more than you'd know. Anyway, folks, I will see you guys at the next episode. Hope you guys have a great week. Take care.